Good evening. Welcome to the first episode of the Culture Site. The Culture Site is a new initiative of the Awarelogue initiative, where we focus on further understanding various aspects of culture, whether it be culture from a tangible perspective or culture in its intangible forms, whether we talk about ancient forms of culture or what we experience today or how it is evolving into the future. Varied aspects of culture will be taken up, whether it be that within Sri Lanka, whether it be that from the Asian region, or even beyond that. This is where on the culture site, we focus exclusively on this domain because it is a very important factor in the field of international relations. For our first session today, we are extremely happy to have all of you joining us, and we have our guest speaker. Our guest speaker is someone I have known for quite some time now, and I'm sure you've had interactions with her at various points. She is a museologist, an arts manager, she's a development professional, an independent consultant, and she's currently a research fellow at the International Center for Ethnic Studies. She's a sociologist by training from the Delhi University in India and the Lund University in Sweden. She has specialized in oral history and museum anthropology at the Columbia University in New York. She speaks regularly on issues concerning social inclusion, culture, and of course, heritage management issues as well. She has several publications to her name, and we'll be talking about some of them in the course of the next 1 hour. One of the most important ones is the Archive of Memory, which is a reflection of 70 years of independence, a marvelous book to have. And of course, Cultural Influence, which is a transformative agenda for caring communities. And we will also be hearing from Hasini about museums, memory, and identity politics in Sri Lanka, which is her latest publication. So without further ado, Hasini, may I invite you to speak to us? We're looking forward to listening to you. We're going to be talking today about cultural capital, enhancing arts and education in Sri Lanka. Over to you, Hasini.
Thank you, John. Thank you very much. So my plan today is to share with you a couple of key concepts and then also my work experience from a more practical dimension on working on education, arts, and museums. So I will try to keep my input minimum so that we can go on to have a longer discussion. So I will just start. Actually, since you mentioned the Archive of Memory, let me start by historically contextualizing what I'm trying to speak today in terms of education, because that's a topic that's really important. And I want to start from a point where I acknowledge what a huge role education has played in post-independence Sri Lanka in completely changing our country. So this especially, I realized when I was collecting stories and oral histories for my Archive of Memory, where I was talking to a lot of people and sort of realized, especially for the rural masses, in the early years of 1960s, 50s, where we were still a society which is pretty much, caste driven and very hierarchical and not so literate as well. The kind of role that education, especially free education, played in ensuring social mobility for people. So that was a real game changer. If you take the last 50 years of our history and you ask me what has been the most drastic change and where did it come from, I would say it's actually education, because before that, we did not have the whole idea that education is accessible to common masses, right? So let's first of all acknowledge what a huge game changer and social leveler and social mobilizer education has been in Sri Lanka. And it is not just Sri Lanka, we see that across the whole world. And I think it's very important to understand and acknowledge this fact. But the question is, now, the context has changed. We are a transformed society. We are not where we were in 1950s anymore. So does the education system that has served us well in the past, can it serve us for the next 50 years? This is the critical question that we need to ask. Now, for instance, one of the key figures that I really appreciate, especially in talking about education, is Sir Ken Robinson. He's a creativity expert. Unfortunately, he passed away about a couple of years ago, but he has spoken a lot on TED Talks on creativity and education, and he really shows us what the roots of the current education system is. And the truth is that it came about, this whole concept of free education for everyone that facilitates social mobility came about in the 18th century with the Industrial Revolution, right? So if you really look at the way schools are organized, you can see that it is by itself is very industrial. A school and a factory, like, classroom, things are produced in batches in a factory. We produce children also in batches. There's the bell, there's some kind of it's just like a factory putting out things that the school system is also emulating at the moment. And let's admit it, it worked for a while. It worked for the last century and first part of this century, but does it serve our future? Now, one of the first facts that we have to admit, especially if you are a young graduate coming out of a university in the country, is that that it doesn't really take you anywhere, right? Because the knowledge that you have gained so far from the education system, however good it is not enough to give you social mobility, ensure you a better future, find your passions, or anything of that sort. So we know that already our education system is failing. I don't want to spend too much time on it. I just want to point out that it's not just a crisis that is in Sri Lanka. It is a crisis that is world over. That is why people like Sir Ken Robinson talk about it. They see it as a global crisis. And we have leaders of education in terms of Finland, Netherlands, the Scandinavian countries who have really taken it seriously and is starting to change education and speak about transformative education, which is about a very futuristic education, which prepares students for the next century, right? So that discussion, in my humble opinion, is not very strong in Sri Lanka anymore, because we are still very much trapped in a exam-driven, competitive mode of education, right? Which is failing us, which will not serve our future, which will not serve economic growth of our country, which is the main struggle that we are doing.
I think you've gotten muted there, Hasini. Sorry.
I don't know how that happened.
Sorry.
Really sorry. Yeah. What was the last thing I said, George? Sorry.
No, you were talking. It was just 2 seconds or so that got messed up there.
Okay. Yeah. So I was talking about what exactly do I mean by cultural capital. Education is actually a part of it, but it's a very basic part of it. Cultural capital, similar to education, is something that actually does ensure social mobility if you're talking about a more stratified community. It's not just education, but something more. It includes things like intellect, educational, emotional intelligence at one level, so making you a much more holistic or well-rounded human being. A very integral part of cultural capital is the knowledge in aesthetics, especially your taste. The fact that you have read your literature, you know your art, you are exposed to film, and that you have refined taste, if I may use those words that we very often use to describe cultural capital. So an aspect of it is the knowledge of the arts and a certain sense of refinement that comes with it, even including, at some level you say about cuisine, about wine, and you can stretch it all to that, right? So that's one. The third element is what we today market a lot as soft skills and personality and positive attitude in a person, the can-do attitude, being able to work in a group of people, being able to blend well, all the social skill set that comes at making you a personality that fits in very well into the society and can contribute at a higher level, while also benefiting from all of that. So the third dimension of cultural capital. This is what we really have as soft skills in today's world, right? And the last is about exposure. The whole idea of well-traveled, well-read, well-traveled. We have this saying in language as well. So this is about your exposure to something that is not just your own background that you come from, your ability or your exposure to different cultures, your ability to speak different languages, move with different kinds of people, and skills to live in a pluralistic and a very global world community. So these are the whole package of cultural capital, and we are already talking about different elements of them, but not in a holistic way as I'm presenting to you right now as a cultural capital. We just speak ad hoc about certain elements of it. And this is why I always try to put this concept onto the table for us to look at it as something that needs to be integrated into education. So, we can speak longer about cultural capital during that, but just to move on, I want to now bring, so how do we promote cultural capital? And actually one of the main ways is education itself. The reason why we say that our education is failing is simply because it is failing to produce this cultural capital or give this cultural capital to our student population. That's the reason we are saying that the education is failing. So then how do we do that in education? How do we sort of work around it? And this is where I would like to share some of my practical examples of working with arts, visual arts, theater, and in museums, in two concepts which I want to talk about. One is arts education, and the second one is arts integrated education. So the first one is arts education. This is the normal education of aesthetics that we have to a certain limited degree. So we do have literature, we do have arts, we do have dance in our schools, but they are all not in the main curriculum, for instance, right? And this is just, again, more or less a theoretical knowledge of literature and history and arts. So that's arts education, and I think it's really important to have that, especially in developing values, the human value set that needs to be promoted to make this island a livable place for all communities. Yeah. But the second concept is that of arts integrated education. That is actually integrating arts to a level which not only gives you knowledge, but also builds up your personality and gives you a skill set. Now, for instance, I experimented with a program called Theatre in Education, where I worked with a theatre group in Sri Lanka, a Sinhala-speaking theatre group, because we needed to train Sinhala-speaking schools. The theatre group was called the Freedom Theatre Group. So what we did was to have a session with theatre practitioners, theatre directors, script writers, makeup artists, or the different varieties that theatre has in itself, to sort of look at what are the skills that they gained by being in theatre, and that reflection was really an eye-opener for me, because a lot of the things that we don't even think of, like things like punctuality, things like cleanliness, things like my health, things like being calm and confident, things like voice projection. All of this is something that you gain if you do theater, right? And it's all multifaceted. You get it by doing it. And we know that in education, that experiential learning is the highest form of learning, not the learning that we know or experience today in the classroom by listening to somebody, a teacher, but actually immersing yourself in something and actually doing it, for yourself. So then what we developed was teaching pedagogy called Theatre in Education, where we brought in theatre games such as role plays, image theatre exercises, voice exercises, and so on and so forth, characterization, etc., to teach any subject in the school curricula. And we took actually grade 7, 8, 9 curriculums, history, mathematics, science, like that, about actually about 6, 7 different subjects. And we worked with teachers in how to integrate these into the curriculum. And then what we did is we worked with teachers from 4 schools. They went back and they tried to apply these methods, and we sort of reported back. And what most of the teachers said after half a year of working with it is that they became naturally the most famous teachers in the school, because their methodology was really attractive to students. Students were paying attention, and there was a marked increase in the scores of children, students, even at the exam. Although exam was the last thing that we wanted to focus on by, contribute, like really introducing this pedagogy. It also did result in increased test results, simply because students didn't have to like really go back and study the lesson all over again. So if they did a theater activity, for instance, the teachers recorded a theater activity where they used image theater exercise for science, where the whole lesson was about producing electricity, and the students did used image theater to do that. And it turned out that that was the most successful lesson out of even in the examination. So now that is a really good example of showing how art integrated education can really work in building up students overall as a personality, not just skills. When I say theater, it's just one main. I work at the same time with arts. I work with a museum. Now, for instance, museums have a section called museum education. I remember one of my greatest aha moments happened when I was studying in New York, studying museology in New York. And I went to the Museum of Modern Art in New York, George. And there was this gallery called Kandinsky Gallery, who was a Russian painter. And he has these paintings which are very geometric. Actually, I couldn't go into the gallery because it was for the moment closed. There was a class lesson going inside the gallery. And I was very curious. So I wanted to know, is this an art class? So I actually asked the teacher, is this an art class? Because the kids were sitting on the ground and really drawing, and there was really animated. And the teacher said, no, it's not an art class. It's a maths class, actually, that's happening inside the gallery, right? So this, for me, is my whole proposition about arts integrated education. So arts is not just a separate subject that has to be taught about for art's sake. Art is a methodology that can be mainstreamed into teaching any subject, teaching maths, teaching science, anything else. So these are the 2 levels of education that I want to talk about mainly. And I think actually I will sort of wrap up with those key points, and take some questions coming from there, because rather than me going on, I think there must be interesting questions that can come up, and we can take the discussion forward like that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hasini, for that overview there in terms of explaining how cultural capital becomes something tangible even in a classroom, how it can be incorporated into education, right? So we invite the audience to send in, participants are more than welcome to send in your questions into the chat box. We have some coming in, some being typed right now. Hasini, just going back to a key point that you came towards the end when you were talking about arts integrated education. You see, there's unfortunately in the Sri Lankan context, we sometimes look at the arts stream, or we would talk about education in this particular area as being, something easy to get by, something not too difficult, not too tough. You can pass it. It's been, I guess, to some extent, to use the word, downgraded in terms of its potential. We're not exploring sufficiently the contribution it's making. You talked about so many aspects a little while ago, whether it is spending a little bit of time every day listening to some music, watching some dancing, appreciating literature, appreciating theater. No doubt, whatever the stream of education may be, these are all important factors, I guess. Could you reflect on that part, please, Hasini? How we can incorporate that into our daily life, especially lots of our participants, we must be having those who are graduates from the art stream, either done it in school or then thereafter coming to university. I've just heard this. I've just heard this, especially coming from the social science field. The people tend to think that, oh, things are not too hard in the art stream. Right? This is a common, I feel, misconception.
Yeah. We dodge that we do not have arts integrated education in Sri Lanka. We don't. So we have education. I mean, we teach art subjects, but that is not arts integrated education. This is very different, two very different contexts and concepts actually, because teaching art or literature or film studies or whatever as a subject is very different, and that will impart you theoretical knowledge about drama, about art history, about paintings or whatever, but that is theoretical knowledge. That does not translate into an overall personality that the cultural capital concept talks about, right? Because the difference is in not just knowledge, it's about the skill set. Because right now our issue is our whole education system is geared towards cramming knowledge, heaping more and more and knowledge. That's what the tests are doing. That's what the examinations are doing. And knowledge in today's world is irrelevant, because knowledge is there on the internet. There's no point in wasting your brain space on hoarding or storing knowledge. Computers do that, not human brains, right? So, and not just now, it was irrelevant 20 years ago. I mean, we are behind. We are already 20, 30 years behind in that kind of thinking. But what I'm focusing on when I say arts integrated education is actually moving from theory into practice, right? So that's where we are not making that ultimate change, because only practice can give you the skill set. Only practice will give you a transformed personality, right? It's not like, let's take a very superficial example, like beauty culture, right? It's not enough to say if you do this you will become healthy or something like that. You can't say, oh, if you do yoga your well-being will go up and all of that. It's a practice. You actually have to practice yoga every day. You actually have to eat healthy every day. You have to take care of yourself. So it's a practice, not knowing in theory and not knowing in language. It doesn't make any difference. So at the moment, our pedagogy, when I say pedagogy, I mean the teaching methods that are being used are 18th century, factory style, industrial size. That's what I said. In factories, you have you produce goods for the masses. So at the moment, what happened is that in the 19th century and early 20th century, we needed to educate huge masses and lift them out of poverty and literacy. So for that, we created education systems which could accommodate 40, 60 students in one class. But this does not work anymore for the future. So the whole world is more and more going towards more customized education. For instance, some students are better at learning differently. They are better at learning together than alone. And so that's the issue. Actually, there is no arts integrated education in Sri Lanka. There is art subjects being taught in schools and universities, but these are two different concepts.
That's a very valid point in terms of the differentiation that you talked about there in terms of the two ideas. So there's a question that has come in, and one of the first questions that has come in. In your opinion, do you believe the mission of contemporary education is to create a global citizen who would think, interact beyond national or regional boundaries, since this might help in resolving much of the political issues we have in the world today? where we are not seeing the human as a human?
I mean, the simple answer is yes, and I don't think there is any solid argument that against that, because we are by nature connected globally, and we are not just connected globally now. We were always connected globally. George, I have talked often about how connected we were even in the second century BCE. So this whole idea of, oh, now this global citizen is a modern idea, this is incorrect, in fact. So we were global, we were an island in a global world, very integrated to trade networks, global commerce, even in the second century BCE. So there has never been a solid argument about not wanting to be a part of the bigger world. I think this whole other idea comes from a very colonial experience and our very insular reaction to it, which is based on nationalism. So we started thinking very insularly about our education, about our languages, for instance. Now look at where we landed with our very not so progressive language policy. I mean, very bad language policy that was introduced. We know that, I mean, there's no need to go on about it. We do know that as important as mother tongues are in terms of language education, the fact that we did not allow not just English, other languages, Arabic, French, all are Chinese, other languages, that to have integrated them to our education system would have definitely resulted in much better communicators and much better labor force that can lead at a global level. So definitely, there was never a good argument against saying that we should look inwards, because by being such a small island, it is not possible to live on our own. We need to be integrated into the bigger world structures and systems.
Absolutely. As you so rightly said, we've been integrated for centuries. This is not something new that we've started doing. It's just that from time to time we get sidetracked, I guess, in terms of, and as you mentioned, that word nationalism, where the term itself has evolved from what it was to what it is now. So a question is coming in terms of defining culture. Could you explain to us how culture evolves? I guess, and that's just the question. I guess that's also in context, assessing of understanding. Sometimes we say, you heard this phrase, oh, it's against our culture. Then in time to come, it changes. I mean, in the Sri Lankan context, I'm sure speaking English at one time was against our culture, so to say. The clothes that we wear would have not been worn. The food that we are eating now would not have been eaten. Could you explain on that? Could you highlight that, please, Hasini?
Yeah, I think that's valid question, an important question, because there is confusion about the term culture, the way in which the normal people, common people understand it, and the way in which, let's say, for instance, anthropologists and sociologists would define as culture. There is a gap in understanding. When I talk about the common understanding of culture, people are mixing two concepts here. What they mean by culture is actually tradition. It's part of culture. It means the way we have done things for a while. That's what it means. Right? So that is actually a tradition. So we say a tradition of dancing. This is the way we have danced for the last 50 years. That's what you mean, right? And then culture, on the other hand, is a much bigger concept, which involves not just the arts, not just the beliefs. It includes very many different spheres. So in fact, it can include our religions, the way we think about spirituality, not just religions, but other forms of things. Our systems of communication, our languages, our literature, our film, right? Our aesthetics, what we mean when we say beautiful or ugly, our idea of the past and historical traditions. So that's another part of culture. And then idea of education or intellectual traditions, the way we communicate knowledge or transfer knowledge from one generation to the next, which we have been doing for, again, millennia. So all of this together is culture, not the much narrower understanding of it in the common mind. And actually, that culture is not something that is like a museum piece, which is not never going to change. That culture is evolving. So language evolves. The Sinhala that we speak today is very different from the Sinhala that we spoke 10 years ago and 50 years ago and 100 years ago. There is no way of stopping culture from changing, because it's a living thing, right? So the whole thing of, oh, our culture is getting ruined, our culture is under attack, and all of that is actually more constructs of a post-colonial nationalist discourse, because it came from a time when we were fighting very hard to get rid of colonial masters, and we needed to come up with a strong idea that sort of brought people together. And this whole idea of culture was something that got solidified at that period of time, and by the way, with very great contributions from the British as well. So it's the Sinhalese nationalism, if you want to talk about it, is not just our own creation. It was, I would say, about 60% created by the British and given to us, and we created the rest of it, right? So I would say all cultures are changing all the time. There is no way of stopping that. So this whole idea of culture as something that we need to protect and keep as if it's like a museum piece is actually incorrect.
Another question is, do you think we can hope that education in Sri Lanka will turn out to be successful, especially in the context of local universities? As someone who has been educated here and overseas, have you ever tried to advise the relevant authorities?
Well, so we have to understand that these relevant authorities are really the bottleneck, unfortunately. And I have actually experienced that. Not, let me say, educational sector the world over is the most conservative. Even if you go to other countries, you go to Europe, you go to United States. By the way, United States doesn't have a great education system either. It's really not very successful, in my own opinion, as somebody who has studied in United States as well. So not just in Sri Lanka, but the world over, the education sector tends to be very, very conservative. And there's a reason for it, because it is really responsible for thousands and thousands of lives and people and our future generations. But what is particularly bad in Sri Lankan situation is that that the Ministry of Education and the National Institute of Education, for instance, who are authorities that are really presiding over the main decisions, that they tend to be politicized, and any kind of policies that we could feed into, they change. So that now in a foreign context, let's say I advised on a policy. I did work on the peace education policy, for instance. So let's say I contributed it, and we came up with a good policy. But by the time you come out with the policy, the government changes, and the moment the government changes, the policy is thrown out, and another guard takes over. And so this is the main problem in advising Sri Lankan ministries, not just education, culture, all of them. So I would say, unfortunately, working with only the state sector in this regard is very difficult. It's not something that one person or one advisor can do. The other thing is that the government will only respond if there is a huge social outcry towards education. They will not respond to some expert who may have had a degree from some foreign university is not important, honestly, to share with you very openly in this forum. So the thing is that our Sri Lankan community is also very, very behind in terms of thinking about education. Now, for instance, one of the biggest problems that I see in the education sector here is this divided school structure, teaching girls separately, boys separately, Tamil students separately, Sinhala students separately, English speaking stream and Sinhala speaking stream. And we have such a divided country, which is creating us so many problems. And we continue to teach our kids in a very divided a school system, and then they come out and then we ask why can't you live together? How can you live together? You have taught them for 13 years in a divided society. Those students cannot create a peaceful or united community. So this we have to be very realistic about. But if, for instance, we now come out and say, let's scrap Royal College, let's make it a co-ed, who do you think will be the first to scream and shout out on the street? Not the government, not the government officials. It will be the Sri Lankan people, normal people, because we are not in our minds open to thinking about a progressive system of education which helps us to address the main challenges that our country is facing in the next 50, 100 years of time.
So I think this comes across more as a comment, Hasini. I think art integration or art integrated education for the last 4 to 5 decades has been centered or rather considered as a responsibility of parents. If they are keen on art and culture, that is transferred from parents to children, where they are exposed to a broader scope of different avenues of art. However, we see less of this in the present generation. And this person says, I hope it will become part of the curriculum soon. Do you see any kind of efforts being taken? I know it's a rather dreary picture at the end of the day, and you talked about how policies keep changing every time there is a change in administration. But do you see any kind of trend towards, I mean, you gave a brilliant example where the children are learning mathematics to art. And now you never think of combining the two. But this is where this out of the box thinking or looking at issues, these are very, very valid points, very valid areas. Do you see a trend towards that? Are we going down that path at all?
So before I respond to George, let me also respond to the comment by Charita, or Charita, I'm sorry, about art integrated education being part of family culture. Again, I'm saying, no, art integrated education doesn't come from family culture, because art integrated education means art becomes a methodology of teaching different things. So what we gain from our families is a love of art. So if you come from a family that has a background where there are readers, there are art lovers, there are people who visit museums, you are likely to absorb that culture, that taste. This is different. This is not art in integrated education. So art integrated education is a very specific method of teaching in schools. It's different. And it is aimed at not just giving you the knowledge component of being well read, on having read Leo Tolstoy to Shakespeare and being able to enjoy Picasso and so forth. But it is more about enhancing things like lateral thinking, critical thinking, and so forth, the social skills. So it's two different things. And the fact that you come from a cultured family definitely gives you the advantage, and that's why we see the stratification we see in the society today continued, and the idea to make this cultural capital accessible to all, irrelevant of which class of society you come from, is a very revolutionary idea. In fact, when free education was first introduced, there was a huge outcry saying, why do you want to educate the chimney sweeper's boy, even in the West, right? Because the people felt that that's not needed. Back in the 17th century, museums were not open to people from the working class. Only from the upper class people could go to the museums, right? So even education and cultural capital has always been the forte of the privileged, because they knew by holding it to that, they have power over the rest. So the moment when we came up with the idea of free education, it was revolutionary, because it was giving access to something that has been traditionally reserved for an elite group of people. So what I'm proposing by introducing cultural capital is also sort of making it go beyond the family backgrounds and elite circles that we usually get it from, but to make it available through a system of education to everyone to have the access to it. So that's the difference that I want to make there.
Sorry.
Yeah.
In terms of that stratification, there's another question that has come in, Hasini, which is saying, though art integrated education is an expressive and successful system, in your opinion, does it only coexist with the developing global nature, for instance, with economical superpowers? And are there any forward suggestions to implement in developing states?
Well, I think the approach is not really about whether it's a developing country or developed countries, so now if you look at the world leaders, for example, who score highest even in terms of test results in the world, Finland, the Scandinavian countries, Netherlands, and all of that, right? So these are also global superpowers, and what they're doing is that they are producing the most creative group of people. In fact, there's another concept that I will throw out. There's a book called Creative Class, if you want to read. I mean, this is actually introducing a new stratification called creative class. This is the class that actually holds power in the world in terms of coming up with most innovative products. So how does the West remain on top of the world? Because they have the most creative brains. And even if there is a very creative brain in Sri Lanka, unfortunately, Sri Lanka cannot sustain it, because the person will get very demotivated in a very quickly. And who will draw it? The developed countries. That's why most successful or the smartest engineers and cyber security engineers and all of that, even from the developing country, are working actually in developed countries, because they give you the environment to hold culturally developed people, and thereby retaining the ability to control the world order and be on top of that world order. Right? So that is being creative, being culturally rich, etc. Yeah, and the whole example of can we do what the developed countries are doing? I would say it's yes and no. So one of the key things that we see when we look at curriculum changes, for instance, in the last 20 years, there has been positive changes. But what hasn't changed is our pedagogy, right? So in changing our pedagogy is not about building more schools. For instance, Sri Lanka is not building any more schools. The population of students are going down because we have a lower birth rate. So we are actually closing rural schools, not opening new schools. So we are not investing more on education. We are investing less and less, unfortunately. Right? But if we retain the same amount of resources and invest in developing the quality of our teachers by improving their skills of teaching, etc., then we can change the system. So that is where I don't buy the whole argument of saying, oh, as developing countries, we cannot afford this. And even though if it's a developing country, we have a school system completely separate to the normal state structure, which is the international schools, for instance. I mean, the richest of the rich go to all these uh, schools that are called international schools, which is a completely different form of education than that offered in the local schools. So, I mean, we have the wealth within the country. It's a matter of distribution and how we utilize it. So, the quality of education cannot change without investing on the quality of teachers. Right now, teaching being one of the lowest paid jobs in the country, we are not set to attract a good caliber teachers. For instance, in Finland, being a teacher is more prestigious than being a doctor or an engineer. They are one of the highest paid jobs in the in Finnish society, and because they say the state made a decision saying we think that doctors are important, but what's even more important are the people who create doctors for the future, right? So and good doctors for the future, not just not just doctors. So if you make a decision like that, you will invest your resources that you already have very differently. That would be my response to that.
Hasini, this I guess goes back to the original point that I talked about in terms of the art stream, where the question is, I guess we need to differentiate here. So that's the question has come up again. What is your opinion about why Sri Lankans downgrade the art stream? For example, most people say, are you doing arts? Whatever you study under art stream, it's useless. 99% of them don't even know how many subjects are there in the art stream. This is, I guess, also a reflection, but
no, it's valid, and again, it's not just valid in Sri Lanka. I would say it is also globally present. So in academic sphere, we say we have a hierarchy of subjects. We know this. We know that maths and science have a bigger value. People give a bigger value to it than history or classics, right? So, I mean, I remember being a student after O levels, what a big fight it was, and what a lot of pressure my teachers made on me because I did not want to go for the science stream, and I didn't want. When I said I don't want to be a doctor, that was a mini fight that I had to do as a 16-year-old person. Also, because it was a waste of, according to them, talent for me to go into the arts stream, right? So it's a reality, and this comes from, again, the job creation element, right? So how much does a doctor get paid? How much does a networking engineer get paid, etc., etc.? So that's one part of it. The fact that the humanities do not necessarily generate high-paying jobs, for instance, at least within the Sri Lankan context. So, I mean, like even a college teacher, which in a different context in the US or in Europe, which would be very highly remunerated and very highly recognized socially, is not so well recognized in Sri Lanka. So one reason of this whole hierarchy and placing arts in a much lower scheme of things comes from the fact that art students do not lead to high-end paying jobs. That's one. But there is a deeper level, which is more social and anthropological in nature, that is limited to our culture. Again, now, for instance, we had a caste system some time back. We don't talk about it anymore, but in a way, it still lingers around. And if you look at the caste structure, people who practice arts were always the lowest castes. The drummers, all of these were really low caste. Now, to take look at the language, for instance, how you would say, if you want to put somebody down, you would say, don't come to dance with me. Like in Sinhala, you would say, don't come to dance. I'm now making a literal translation into, don't come to do this with me. So, so these are all indications that historically we had a little bit of a low recognition of arts. This is not way back into the Polonnaruwa and Radipur period. No, this happens in pre-colonial, especially the Kandian era, where the current caste system that we still see in the country started getting formulated and crystallized. And in that hierarchy, the dancers, the artists, and all of them were around 7th or 17th, 18th caste in that whole hierarchy of things. So we sort of started looking at them in a manner in which was not dignified. So this is why, for instance, now look at the West and even in India. Now, if you are a very rich person, being an art patron is something that adds to your status. It's a high status thing. You know the Medicis were the greatest sponsors of art, in Florentine Italy. And even if you take modern India, the Tatars and all of it, the biggest business people will invest in film institutes and museums and art galleries, etc. Right? But if you look at the Sri Lankan top people, they would invest in building temples or something religious, but not art. So that comes from a different, a more long-standing historical phenomena that we need to actually actively try and transform for the sake of our future.
I guess you bring us to a very important point there, Hasini, where history is so relevant. I mean, when you drew on the caste system and you reflected on what it was, and you use that phrase, "Maatheka natandendipa," or "don't come to dance with me," there's a connection there which we sometimes don't reflect on sufficiently. We don't realize these connections. Hasini, I remember when we spoke a few months ago, you used a term. You said museums are cultural powerhouses, and you just mentioned museums too. How did you get into this? You did something very revolutionary. There are very few people who are going into the study of museums in Sri Lanka, for example. You are a museologist today. Can you tell us why you got into this, how you got into this, and what your experience has been in this field?
Yeah, I said today, it's not possible for anybody, not just me, but anybody to even discover that there is a subject called museology, for instance. I started studying it when formally started studying it in a university at the age of 35, by the time I had even finished my master's, in fact, right? So, because when you are young, you have very different priorities. You need to get out. So unless you are part of the British aristocracy, you can't be studying art history or museology. These are things. These are traditional subjects that the British aristocracy or those people see. Again, cultural capital being reserved for a very elite group of people, right? So by just being able to study it means you don't really have to worry about your economics, your oranges and butters already taken care of. But like if you come from a middle class family, then you have to think of what your future is, what kind of job, how do you earn your bread and butter. These are not simple questions. These are really important questions for young people. And then I even for me, between art history and sociology, I would say let me study sociology, because it would give me a better range of economic opportunities and job opportunities vis-a-vis art history or museology, and how people do not recognize that as a career at all in the Sri Lankan context. So my work in how I discovered museology was really through my work in education and arts. So for a long time, I managed an arts and culture portfolio for the German Development Corporation, which was really working on peace education and working with communities on ensuring that we contribute towards an inclusive identity for this country. So in that, I took part in many programs that sort of really opened my eyes towards what a transformative experience museums are. So people could actually walk into a museum, and if facilitated properly, if guided properly, you could walk out having had a real epiphany or like a change of perspectives about certain things. It will get you to think very differently about certain things. So that sort of um, really motivated me to look at museums as educational sites, and the fact that we are not using that well enough in our country's context. Now, then what I did was, of course, go and study it and come back, and then I undertook a baseline survey of museums in Sri Lanka, because by the time I returned in 2016, nobody had actually done a proper survey of museums. Nobody even knew how many museums Sri Lanka actually had at that moment. So one of the first things that I did was to sort of locate how many museums are there in the country. And voila, surprise, surprise, we have over 100 museums in the country. You wouldn't think so, right? So yeah, we have about 120. And it's a very fast growing sector. We open museums every year almost right now. Yes, it's also huge because museums are very integral to expanding tourism, which plays a huge role in the economy. So, I mean, of course, what drew me to museums was my love for education and my interest in education. But then I realized that museums as a site that has a huge amount of potential, not just for education, but also for driving economic growth by being a part of tourism and heritage promotion, which clearly is a big portion of our country's future earnings. So, I mean, in short, that's how I sort of got involved in it. And for those who are curious about that subject, my book is Museums, Memory and Identity Politics in Sri Lanka. That can be ordered online at vidarshana.lk. So if you go there and just find there is the English publication, which is the full study. There is a summary that is published also in Sinhala. But if you want to read the case studies, where I visited 25 museums out of the 100 odd museums and did a detailed study on assessing them to understand where we are in terms of a country with museums, I think the best publication is actually the English version of the book.
Fascinating, Hasini. Thank you so much. Every conversation we have enlightens us so much more. I mean, whether it was on conversations I had with you earlier this year or in the last couple of years as well, where we've focused, and especially the work that you're doing, it's a very unique area, but it's a very vital area. You talked about the relevance to tourism. There's the economic side to it. There's the education side to it. There's the arts in general. I mean, that's one of the most important areas there. And you're doing a lot in terms of preservation of that. I also know that you conduct guided tours of the Colombo Museum, which is fascinating. Having been on them, you really learn so much. You look at art objects not just as something on display, but you try to understand the history behind it. And this is where, as you very rightly said, museums are cultural powerhouses. They are so vital to society. So thank you so much to all of our participants. We've been talking about cultural capital, and whether we talk about it from an arts integrated into education, from that perspective, or we look at it from museums, or we look at it from music or dance or painting, or whatever we want to appreciate, there's so much more to life and so much more that we need to reflect upon. Because at the end of the day, we come from a country that is steeped in history. Go around the world, these countries are all steeped in history. They've got various aspects, multifaceted forms. Their societies are rich, just like ours is. And we need to try to understand that much better. This is going to lead us down a very different path. The more you learn, the more you learn to respect diversity. And arts education certainly teaches us this diversity in terms of appreciating the other, appreciating all that we sometimes don't realize ourselves. So thank you once again, Hasini, for a very, very eloquent presentation, and also your wonderful responses that you provided our participants. Thank you so much for taking time to join us this evening on the culture site. The Awarelogue initiative has a lot of other programs coming up. Exactly in a month's time, on the 20th of August, we will be focusing on a cultural icon in Sri Lanka, Professor Edrivira Saratchandra, who made a monumental contribution to this country and to culture in this country through his work. It will be his 25th death anniversary next month, and we will be having a reflection and also a conversation around him, around the man, understanding him. We've looked at his work, we've studied his work, but it's time now to understand the person. And we're hoping to do that on the 20th of August on the next episode of the Culture Site. The Awarelogue initiative has lots of other programs coming up. Next week, we're talking about the Indo-Pacific and the impact on Sri Lanka. In the month of August, we're going to be talking about Rajiv Gandhi and his foreign policy towards Sri Lanka, and many other platforms that have been created, the book list on one side, Decoding Diplomacy podcast on the other. So stay tuned and join us on the Awarelogue initiative. Thank you, Hasini, and thank you very much, everyone, for joining us and taking time to be a part of the Culture Site. Have a good evening.